All right, how about now? Coming through okay? Thumbs up. All right, good deal. All right, thank you all for being here. My name is Andy Applebaum. I am going to be presenting on building and defending a machine learning classifier. This is really just my experiences in the machine learning security evasion competition in 2021. I took third, and of course I have the meme up there because I had to. A quick outline, just about me. I am a security researcher. I primarily focus on the intersection of security and AI. I previously was with MITRE, where I did a lot of stuff with the attack framework, Caldera, threat-informed defense, things like that. Personally, I am an avid chess player. Love playing chess, and if you ever see me on my phone, I'm probably just playing chess. This presentation is, as I said, my experiences in the 2021 MLSEC competition. It includes two segments, building a classifier used in the competition and also attacking other people's classifiers in the competition. And it also includes a lot of lessons learned and kind of side observations that hopefully for others who are looking to kind of get into machine learning and security might be useful. This slide deck is also accompanied by some open source code. It's available online, really the defensive stuff I did, the model I built, the data, all sorts of stuff to kind of hit the ground running if you wanted to run with this on your own, as well as a white paper and another talk at a separate conference called CAMLIS, where I focus primarily on the defensive aspect. As one disclaimer, this was a side project for me. It was fun. It was solely a personal project, so it was very much me saying, hey, I want to dive into something, get better at it, learn about it. So it really is. If it seems a little rough around the edges in some places, that's my excuse. As a big motivation for this talk, there is the 2021 MLSEC competition, or Machine Learning Security Evasion competition. This was a public competition that's been run, I think, 3 years so far, 2021, 2020, and 2019, put on by a few companies on really trying to let people build and attack machine learning-based malware classifiers. And there's two tracks as part of the competition. There's the defend track, where you submit a classifier designed to detect malware, and the attack track, where they give you, hey, here are 50 malware samples, make them evade everybody's classifiers. And as a personal project, my goal here was to just submit something to the defender track. I thought it would be fun, it would be good to learn, it would be, I don't know, a good experience. And it didn't have to do well, I just wanted it to get in, just for the sake of saying hey, I did it. So with that said, I wanted to give a little bit of kind of introduction and background. Why is there such a very specific competition? And I think it almost goes entirely without saying that machine learning has made a lot of hard problems tractable between natural language processing, computer vision, game playing, all sorts of stuff. The advancements are kind of through the roof. And this includes security. This, machine learning has been applied across a wide variety of domains, malware classification, guessing passwords, intrusion detection, and it's something that isn't just in academia, it's in industry too. This is an old chart from 2019 of I found in some blog of look at these companies, they all use machine learning, or they say to. Probably even more now. And really, at the end of the day, most security nowadays, there's usually some sort of AI or machine learning story, when be it you're reading a blog post or a vendor thing, you often find the two mentioned with each other. And for MLSEC, we're really looking at applying machine learning towards static malware detection, really looking at, in this case, PE files, Windows executables. And there's two, and this is a gross oversimplification, and I apologize, but there's two ways to look at static kind of malware detection. There's signature-based, where we're looking at known indicators, like MD5, strings, things like that. This is super quick, it's reliable, low false positive, but it struggles with new malware. You'll often miss things if it doesn't fit into the IOCs that you have. By contrast, there's what I'd say heuristic-based detection, where you find similarities between a given file and a set of known bad files. And that's where machine learning comes in, because you can start doing that pattern recognition. And this is great because you can detect new malware with higher accuracy, but of course has some drawbacks where you got to have training data, it can be a little slow, and accuracy can be hit or miss. And there's been a ton of work applying machine learning to static malware detection. Two kind of popular models I'm going to talk a decent bit about are Ember on the left. This is a specific machine learning model and a set of data that some researchers published a few years ago, A lot of folks use it for benchmarking. And then Malconv is another machine learning framework where they use a neural network to detect malware. I mean, both are cited a lot kind of within this realm of literature. Now, if you just go off of the news, and I don't want to say hype, but if you just read about, machine learning in the news, it'll sound like it's a silver bullet. And for a variety of reasons, machine learning is not a silver bullet. You can't just slap machine learning onto something and say, I solved it, I'm done. There's a lot of things you got to do. And one of the issues with machine learning is something called adversarial examples. This idea kind of came around with this paper in 2013, where they realized that I might have a machine learning classifier that has really high accuracy, but what I can do is I can look at that classifier and kind of modify things in ways that are imperceptible to humans, normally, but really throw off the machine learning algorithm entirely. I know it's small, but these pictures on the bottom are an example here where we start with the image on the left, add a little bit of noise in the middle that, as humans, we don't see that. And you get the image on the right, and to us it's the same, but to a machine learning classifier, this image here, or let's go with this one here, the dog, it says, yes, this is a dog, you add some noise, and now over here it says it's an ostrich. And so it turns out that this is a relatively big problem within this kind of the machine learning ecosystem. Adversarial examples are a problem that started really as like, hey, neural nets, that's kind of where they're coming from, but really most machine learning algorithms have some sort of story to tell with adversarial AI, adversarial examples, where you can take a thing that would be normally classified by a classifier and add some noise to it, and all of a sudden everything's off. And this includes security. There's been some papers in the past few years which say like, hey, I'm gonna go build this machine learning classifier for a specific kind of malware, and it'll work great, but then I'm gonna take what I know about that classifier and find a way to create malware that specifically gets by it. And there's a lot of well, not a lot, but there's a decent amount of papers in the literature that talk about different ways to do this. This has been applied to Android malware, PDF malware, Windows executables. It's been applied to a variety of things, and it seemed to be like a pressing thing that the community should worry about, which when in that context, well, yeah, a competition makes sense, because what we can do is, there's all this buzz about security and ML, lots of research, but let's put a competition out there to join the two and really advance the state of the art. So I apologize, I know that's a mouthful. So I'm gonna switch gears a little bit and talk about actually participating in the competition. I'm gonna be talking about something called Kipple, which is the name I gave to my Defender submission, my detection kind of machine learning algorithm. I'm gonna say Kipple a lot, I apologize. I don't know if anyone gets the reference, it's really obscure. All right, so as kind of a preamble to talking about how I built Kipple, the machine learning, the MLSEC competition, it had kind of four main phases. There's the registration phase, the defender phase where you build the classifier, the attacker phase where people attack the classifiers, and then kind of the announcement of winners. And for the defender track, we had about 5 weeks to build a classifier. The organizers provided an example in Docker that you can just kind of download off of GitHub. You just run it, and poof, you've got a malware classifier. And they did have a few entry restrictions saying like, hey, you need to meet these specific guidelines to be eligible in the competition. One of them was it needs to take less than 5 seconds to classify a sample. It also needs less than 10% of a false negative rate, so it needs to be able to actually spot malware. But it also needs less than 1% false positive rate, which means that it's not just saying like, hey, everything is malware, so you can't evade it. And the winning model is the one that had the least evasions, the one that was able to detect the most. So the approach I took to build Kipple was kind of 5 steps, relatively straightforward. First, I was going to obtain, or I did obtain, a set of normal malware, just kind of going off of some public repositories. Then using that normal malware, I built a set of anti-ML malware, kind of taking the normal malware, modifying it specifically to evade a classifier. I then trained an initial model kind of for baselining a little bit, only on the original malware to see how well we could detect things just kind of out of the box. I then trained a whole bunch of models on different sets and combinations of the original and adversarial malware to see what approach might work best. and then combined the different models together and chose the one that worked best. So to walk through this in more detail, step one, getting the malware. There were a few different sources I looked to. The first was something called the Ember dataset. This is freely available online. This is the feature vectors. It's not the raw malware or the raw binaries, but the feature representation of 1 million different PE files broken into malware, benign, and whether or not they didn't know. And this formed the basis for a lot of the training data and some of the test data I used. Then I also was able to get random malware from virus share. This was actually rate limited when I was downloading, which was, I think it was like one per every 15 seconds or something. And I wasn't working with a lot of hard drive space for a variety of reasons. And I only got about 7,600 when just kind of letting it run all day and all night. There was another malware set, actual binaries called Sorel. This one's freely available online as well. I was also downloading this one, hard drive limited and a little bit rate limited. So I got about 32,000 samples there. I also needed some examples of benign binaries, and for that I just looked on my own computer and got about 2,500, which were just random things accumulated over 15 years. And then as part of the MLSEC competition proper, they gave us some example data, 150 normal malware instances and about 544 adversarial instances that were submitted as part of the attacker track in the MLSEC 2019 competition. So okay, I have a bunch of malware, and now I want to generate adversarial malware. I've got the normal stuff, and now I want to take that normal stuff and make it anti-ML. And for that, I followed, I used 3 different approaches. The first 2 used specific libraries that are both open source, available online, that are adversarial AI focused. So these are able to take in Windows malware and modify them specifically to be evasive. The first is Malware RL, which makes small changes, chaining them together to take a piece of malware, make it evade a classifier. And the other is SecML malware, which makes a little bit bigger changes, and both have a very heavy adversarial ML focus. The other approach I took was to generate new malware, and for this I just generated lots of different versions of Meterpreter, more or less, and just having it compile to a PE file and varying a ton of the different options, including throwing extra code in there for the fun of it. And as I mentioned, all of these are open source. They're available online. They're all out there. And in total, I generated about 131,000 different malware samples spread across 3 different categories. The first being looking at the Sorel data I downloaded and converting those into different adversarial samples. Same thing for the virus share, and then using MSF Venom. So got a nice kind of wide set of different data here. Another thing I did was I've got all that training data. Now I'm going to generate some test data to make sure that my approach is useful, right? I can't, build an algorithm, build a classifier on some data and then test it on that data, because it'll obviously know that the training data is, what the labels are. And there were 3 sets here. The first was the one included as part of the MLSEC competition. This was just 544 example adversarial malware instances. The second was taking some of the MLSEC examples, those 150 that they gave us, and using Malware RL on them. That generated a nice small set of 1,400. Then the third, kind of the same idea, but using SecML malware, and that I generated 746. So I got a nice little set of training data, and what I can do is look at that and or use that to validate that these different classifiers I build are actually useful. And a few lessons learned in case anyone's looking to try any of this on their own. The first is to make sure you have a lot of disk space. I initially built this on a small Linux VM on my personal PC. It was less than 30 gigabytes that I allocated. This was a huge mistake, and it came as a problem in downloading models, samples, anything, and even generating new data. I constantly was resizing my VM and eventually made it to 300 gigabytes, and that worked well, but it would have saved me time and heartache to just start there. And also just dedicate enough time if you're going to do this. When downloading samples, if you are rate limited, it takes time. And when you're generating new samples, that takes time as well. So oftentimes I would just like leave things running overnight, and I'd have multiple things running at once. And this is all on a personal PC at home. My power bill was through the roof. And looking back, I should have just done stuff in the cloud. So I wasn't paying Dominion Power as much money as I ended up paying them. All right. So step number 3, building an initial model. And for this, I really just followed the basic kind of baseline, not gold standard, but standard of using Ember. And I just followed the normal Ember model training code, set the false positive threshold to 1% as per the guidelines of the competition, and ran the results. And overall, it did fairly well. A few blips here and there, but just kind of taking Ember off the shelf and training it, running it, I got some decent results, on the normal malware. That said, when looking at the adversarial malware, the malware designed to evade a classifier, things weren't as nice. First, it struggled with the 2019 adversarial data and the malware RL and gamma samples when applied to SORL. You can see the mid-90s that we had before, those are jumping down to the high 50s. These are pretty easily getting by Ember. We do see, though, that it can detect some of the adversarial attacks off the shelf, DOS header manipulation, and the 2 padding attacks that I had. I also noticed that the virus share variants over here, those were easier to detect for Ember than the SORL variants, just kind of overall. This was likely because there was some mixing of the data there. And then the MSF ones, all the different interpreter variants, Ember struggled with those big time, even more so than with the adversarial ML ones, which was, I always think it's interesting when interpreter can't be detected. And a few lessons learned. The first thing was, if you are looking to get into this, a basic model is reasonably accurate. Ember by itself on the normal malware did a good job, and as a side project, it was fun just kind of downloading stuff off the shelf, hitting play, and all of a sudden I've got a malware classifier, so it was nice. Also, if you're doing this, make sure to keep good records. I ended up doing a lot of different things and not taking good notes and forgetting what I had tried and what I didn't try and all sorts of different stuff that I'm not going to get into. And then also make sure to separate your training and your testing data, just because, as you saw with a little bit of the virus share stuff, it was some cross-pollination there. And so, yeah, just make sure to track where your data is coming from and make sure to generate test data that's different than your trained data. I've got a little bit more on that in the white paper, but it was interesting finding some of the results that I got. All right, so we've got normal malware, adversarial malware, we've got the initial model, and now I want to build some advanced models. And the first idea here is to just use something called adversarial retraining. And the idea is, well, I'm going to take the Ember idea and just retrain it to include those 130,000 malware samples I generated, right? I'm going to retrain it including those. And when you do that, it does pretty well. It's a straightforward idea. Just use those, pop them in there, and we see a good performance boost. And when you compare it against the initial model on the left and the retrained model on the right, what you can see is when it comes to just looking at normal malicious, these two right here, normal malicious malware samples, Ember does a little bit better than the retrained model, but overall they're kind of in the same ballpark. But on the adversarial side, we're going from 50s and 70s to 70s and 80s. We're doing much better just using retraining. So this was nice to see as well, just because it was like, hey, this is clearly better than using Ember. I'm already beating that baseline, and if I submitted that to the competition, I would feel good about myself. But I didn't want to stop there. I wanted to kind of do more advanced things too, or at least try to. And the idea I had was, okay, I'm going to build a set of different variations of what I want to train and what I want to test on. And the first idea was I want to follow one of two paradigms, kind of dictating what I want to distinguish between. One of them called all, I wanted to distinguish between normal PE files and the adversarially modified PE files. And so when I say normal, I mean both benign and malware, the idea being that anti-ML PEs, those might be distinguishable in and of themselves. which is a little bit out there, but it was one thing to test. And then benign, which is I'm going to train specific models looking at benign PEs versus adversarial PEs. And then underneath that as well, I had lots of different ideas on what different types of adversarial samples I wanted to train against. 4 ideas in total. One of them was to just train against everything. I called that adversarial. One of them was variance, which was just the anti-ML PE files that are generated, malware RL and SecML malware. MSF, which was the MSF Venom ones, and undetected, which was effectively the MSF Venom instances that were particularly evasive. So that's 8 different combinations, and of course I'm going to produce an eye chart. I'm not going to go through these in all detail, aside from saying that variance performed the best, just kind of across the board. It was clear that that model was doing a good job over here on detecting the adversarial malware, not so good over here, but did a good job. The MSF models didn't do well much at all. Training on kind of these interpreter variants, it didn't really seem to help. The benign case outperformed all. I'm not going to get into that too much. And the undetected case, that was a little bit reversed. And again, I'm not going to get into that too much, but there's a bit of interesting internals when you look at the training data that was used between these different models. So okay, I've got 1 million models now, and I'm going to choose the best combination. And basically the idea was I'm going to choose up to 3 models, find thresholds for each to ensure I hit 1% false positive rate, and then compare performance. And unsurprisingly, another eye chart. A couple of quick things I'd say is a few of the models, initial, retrained, and the adversarial along with initial, those did well on normal malware, but struggled on adversarial malware. The models trained on the interpreter instances, those did well overall, but relatively speaking, they really weren't particularly standout. And then these models that were a mix of variance and undetected, all these different combinations, those seem to shine the most, doing the best on adversarial malware while also doing decently on normal malware itself. And again, I apologize, I know it's an eye chart. I was going to skip to the chase, which was that I ended up choosing this row somewhat randomly. It's not the best, I don't know why I chose it, but I chose it. And that's what I ended up submitting as Kipple. I also did a few things to make it a little bit stronger. I hard-coded the MD5 hashes of the benignware that I was using, just so I lowered my false positive. I also used something that was called a stateful detection mechanism. This was given free to me. It was something included by the MLSEC organizers. The idea behind it was whenever a new sample comes in as benign, or a new sample comes in, we run the classifier on it. If the classifier thinks it's benign, we're going to compare it against the last X number of submissions. And if any of those are malware and it looks like them, we're going to classify it as malicious. The idea being that if an adversary is trying to kind of push the classifier in one direction, it can pick up on that. After all that, about a day before the deadline, I got it in and I was super happy. Okay, let's switch over to the attacker track now and talk about how I tried to defend my classifier by attacking the others. This was never my intention walking into it. I just ended up committing so much time to it that I figured I'd invest more. As a quick disclaimer, some of the details here are missing. This was kind of ad hoc as I was doing it, so some things are embellished, some of the numbers aren't exactly right, but generally the idea is there. So to give a little bit of context, right when the attacker track kicked off, there were a total of 6 entries into the defender track. It was Kipple and 5 others. And right off the bat, in the first few weeks, Kipple was doing great. The other models all had hits against them. Kipple was basically picking up everything, so I was super happy. A couple weeks, or maybe a week later, 2 models start catching up. One called AMSQR, A-M-S-Q-R, and another one called Secret. The other 3 are really far behind, but Kipple's ahead, and I'm like, okay, this is good. Then a little bit later, the other 2 models continue catching up, and it occurs to me that at this rate, Kipple isn't going to do, it's not going to get in the top 2, which is where I was hoping to get, but I wanted to get there. So I think, well, maybe I'm going to need to actually do something on the attacker track. And to provide a little bit of background, the way The way the attacker track worked was specifically around scoring. Basically, the MLSEC organizers, they provided 50 malware samples labeled 1 to 50. Attackers can either do one of two things. They can query one or more of the target models that they're interested in to see what the label is, or they can submit an attack. The query is quick, it's unlimited. You just kind of throw it out there, you get a result back real quickly, piece of cake. The attack is much more in-depth. That's kind of like saying, yes, I want you to count this specifically as a submission, and they actually detonate it in a sandbox to make sure that you haven't done that it actually works. And this one's limited to about 50 an hour or so. And the way scoring works is that attackers get a point by creating a working variant that evades a classifier. So if I submit a working variant of 001 and it evades all 6 classifiers, I get 6 points. There is, however, a maximum of 1 point per classifier per sample. So there's a maximum attacker score of 300. They also must be functional, and they need to adhere to a couple of rules that I'm not going to go into aside from that they're smaller than 2 megabytes. And then tie breaks are broken by the number of queries and attacks. So if I'm querying, 5 million times against the classifiers, I'm going to lose on tie breaks versus someone who queries, 5 times. On the defender side, things are a little bit different. You'll effectively lose a point if an attacker is able to evade the classifier for a given sample. However, unlike the attacker track, there's no limit to the number of points you can lose. So if I submit 001 variant A and then variant B against Kipple and both of them evade, I'm going to lose 2 points for that, versus on the attacker side, you're only going to get 1 point because it only counts for 1 sample. So with that in mind, I thought, well, maybe the best way to make Kipple better is to go on offense. If I can submit variants of the different samples that Kipple detects, but the others don't detect, I'm going to relatively increase the score of Kipple. This is silly and it kind of gaming the system, but it's a contest. It's fun. So I said, I'm going to give this a shot and go to the drawing board. There's 2 ways to look at evasion. One of them is traditional evasion, AV evasion, fully undetectable. We want to take, a file, get it out there, obfuscators, cryptors, packers, all that fun stuff. The other is adversarial ML, anti-ML evasion. Things like adversarial examples, malware RL, SecML malware. And having invested as much time as I did in anti-ML, I decided that this would be best. Number one, I think adversarial ML is fun. I hope to convey that in this talk as well. I also have the infrastructure in place for anti-ML. I've got malware RL, I've got SecML malware, I've got a bunch of other stuff. Kipple also should detect the anti-ML attacks. And then also, I think traditional obfuscation is harder. I'm not very experienced in this domain, and I don't have good infrastructure. My Linux VM isn't a great AV obfuscation testbed. And I'm also not sure if Kipple can even detect traditional obfuscation. So I decided to go with anti-ML, and just as a brief interlude, I'm going to talk about something called MITRE Atlas. How many people are familiar with MITRE ATT&CK? A lot of people. Has anyone else seen MITRE Atlas? Okay, so I'm going to show a little bit about MITRE Atlas because I think Atlas is cool. It's a framework. It's available, atlas.mitre.org. But as you might guess with my preamble, it is an attack-like framework for adversarial AI attacks. I'm taking that same matrix idea, attacker's perspective, that kind of stuff, and applying it to adversarial ML. Some of the things that I like about Atlas in particular, and again, I'm just speaking for myself. Number one, it includes the full life cycle of adversarial attacks. It's not just limited to evasion and adversarial examples. I bring this up as I'm not doing it nearly enough justice, this idea of anti-ML. Atlas does a better job. It's also broken into tactics and techniques like the attack framework, written largely from the attacker's perspective. So as I'm looking at the competition, I want to go conduct an attack. I can consult Atlas for constructing the TTPs I want to use. It's also backed up with public examples from case studies and reports that are contributed by the community. So you get a little bit of examples of how to do some of these attacks. And then it's attack-like, and if you wanted to integrate it with some of the other kind of attack ecosystem of models, it's not that hard. So with that said, I had kind of a 5-step attack workflow. The first was, and again, I'm using kind of the Atlas notation, AML.T0016. I was going to obtain capabilities, getting some adversarial ML stuff, kind of locally. Well, I already did this. I I've got malware RL, I've got SecML malware, I'm good to go. Number 2, AML T0040, ML model inference API access. This one's kind of provided by the competition. They've set up an API and I can query it to access these 2 target models that I'm specifically focused on. Then ML attack staging, I'm going to use replicate ML model. The idea is that I'm going to throw a bunch of data at AMSquare and Secret, the 2 models that are kind of giving me grief on the scoreboard, and I'm going to query them a bunch. And based on the results of those queries, I'm going to train a model that I think can replicate what they detect. And then I'm going to do attack staging, adversarial, craft adversarial data black box transfer. The idea is that I've got this replicated model. I'm going to construct a bunch of stuff locally, see if it bypasses my replicated model, and then if it does, when we get to the last one, impact, evade ML model, I'm going to submit those that get by. I'm also going to kind of put guardrails for myself so that when I do submit an attack against the target models, I try to guarantee that it will be detected by Kipple, so I don't end up hurting myself, right? I want to do that relative imbalance. Just real quickly, one of the nice things about having a matrix is you can visualize it. We've got this nice little workflow of resource development, ML model access, attack staging, and then impact. So again, if you haven't checked out Atlas, atlas.miter.org, it's a lot of fun. All right, so profiling the competition, what I did is, this is the ML model inference API access along with replicate ML model. Here I submitted some benign and adversarial samples to the 2 target models that I was worried about. These were just taken from Kipple's training data, so the same data I was talking before. I submitted roughly 20,000 things in total. All of the benignware, all 2,500, and then a lot of malware RL and some of the SecML malware data as well. And you can look at the results and you can kind of see the accuracy over here. They both do well on malware RL and gamma, or which is SecML malware. But what's interesting is that they both kind of take a little bit of a hit with the benignware. Secret in particular misclassifies 60% of the benignware that I submitted as malware. So it was very sensitive to anything being thrown at it. Definitely it's not 1% right there. So I got all those labels, and what I did is I just trained another Ember-like model just following those labels. And basically saying if AMSquare or Secret, they classified a file as benign, regardless of the truth, assign it a label 0, otherwise 1. And then I use the same parameters as Kipple, effectively just kind of building a model that looks like what I'm trying to evade. Then to submit the attack, I just ran malware RL and SecML malware on those 50 samples I need to make evasive. And I generated random variants. I then made sure that the following 2 conditions hold, that it evades the replicated model that I have, but it's also detected by Kipple, again, not to hurt myself. And then each hour, more or less, submit a set of 50 of these samples that are supposed to evade the target classifier. Now this is just a few notes. I did rely on a lot of scripted processes. There were a lot of submissions. I used a black box attack against the local model, which is not the way you should do this. You should use something a little bit better. And I should also just note that this approach, this entire workflow, is fun in the context of a competition, but is unrealistic for what a real adversary might do. So how did it work? And again, please take numbers with a grain of salt. I had about 1,600 different submissions as attacks. About half of those weren't functional or were duplicates, so they didn't count. They were thrown out right away. They got detonated. Not good enough. But the other half, 761, were eligible for scoring. And I got a bunch of results to see how I did. And when you look at the 3 middle columns, these are the 3 models I wasn't too concerned about. You can see we've got a good success rate evading them, even though that wasn't my goal. It was, we can get 500, 170, 290, right? Was able to get a lot of good points against these. Wasn't the goal, but, hey, nice benefit. Against AMSquare, though, only get 49 evasions out of 761. And that's really not a lot, and not nearly as much as I was hoping to have gotten from running this attack. Against Kipple, a little bit of friendly fire. 5 of the ones I submitted got by it just because of some bad practices on my end. Won't talk about them. But Secret got nothing. Couldn't get it to misclassify anything. It was just Nope, it was able to detect everything I threw at it. And so, okay, I apologize for the graphics, but that didn't work. I was able to get a few points off of AMSquare, but nothing on secret. And I've got about maybe a week and a half left in the competition. I'm pot committed at this point, so I want to try something. So what else can I do? Well, what if I look at different individual instances? I can see here, this is a chart of how many evasions per sample there were, and you can see some samples were easy to get by some of the classifiers, and some were a lot harder to get by the classifiers. And if we focus specifically on AMSquare, we can see that samples 2 and 18, most of the 49 that got by it were those 2 individual samples. It was struggling with those for whatever reason. And so I thought maybe I can just focus on these 2, generate a bunch of ones, make them really evasive. But really, this is only going to slowly generate points versus this one model, so it's not quite what I'd like to do. Okay, so that's not going to work too well. What about going back to Atlas and seeing, what other TTPs can we use? I'd say, okay, obtain capabilities. Maybe I can get a new attack type. I'm going to find a different framework to use, a different anti-ML framework, and see if this works. There's something called Malware. This is kind of similar to Malware RL. It's an RL, a reinforcement learning-based framework to sequence actions together to evade a specific classifier. It's open source, available online. Dockerized too, it's very easy to just download, run, get working. And it's conceptually similar to Malware RL. It's got a very similar action space, a little bit different. But it's really got that reinforcement learning. You download it, point it in the direction of something, and you just let it run, and it works. So I get it. I swap out the included model for that replicated model I had. Maybe this capability will be stronger than the other 2 I'm using. Initially, it was able to easily evade the model I gave it, but all of the PE files it generated were like massive. So it was just like appending a bunch of stuff, and eventually it was able to evade the classifier. But I had a restriction of 2 megabytes. So I modified it, say, okay, now you can only do less than 2 megabytes, and still got some evasive files out of it. I got 51 valid submissions that I was able to throw out there, but none of them really got by. Only 2 bypassed AMSquare, and again, secret didn't work. Okay, so no progress versus the existing capabilities. And again, I'm invested, so all right, going back to the drawing board. MITRE Atlas, what else can I do here? We've got maybe a week, a little bit more, maybe a little bit less left in the competition. Okay, what about something fun like reconnaissance, right? It sounds silly, but maybe I can use reconnaissance. And looking at the scoreboard, you can see we've got these 2 columns here. I know it's a little small, but I've got the author, I've got the model name. So the first one, you can see FM by something or other. It's a random string. That's nothing. I can't use that. Secret is the name of a model, but secret is probably secret because they're hiding it. That's what I thought. So that one's out. A1, that's too generic. Don't think I can use that. But AMSquare, well, what about that? And so I go to Google, throw in AMSquare, and bam, I get a personal web page and a GitHub repository. And I think this is wonderful. I can look through and see if there's some adversarial ML or some ML stuff on there for malware. Maybe point me in the right direction of what I need to do. But unfortunately, there was nothing about malware, so that didn't work. But I wasn't quite done yet. The competition had a public Slack channel, and you can see on September 10th, a little bit before the deadline for the attacker track, the admin posted the current scoreboard. And I noticed a little thumbs up there. Mouse over, and I got a name, and on a whim, I throw the name into Google. I know, this is crazy. This is crazy. If you ever invest in something, you just go down the rabbit hole. But I throw the name in there, and I get a bunch of hits. I get a Twitter, a Scholar, and a GitHub, and I get that Fabricio is an author at something called Secret, which turns out to, skipping ahead a little bit, an academic research lab. Secret isn't like we're hiding the model name. That's the name of the lab. They focus on, security and ML stuff. And they won the 2020 MLSEC competition, wrote a paper about it that's freely available, have a blog post about what they did in 2020, and have access to their model, their classifier online that I can go to and just check out. But it gets better. That's not it, no. In the blog post, they've got the code for their 2020 model on there. Not the data, but the code. They've got how they won 2020, and they've got the dropper that they used in 2020. And finally, I'd found what I've been looking for. I think this is going to be great. And after a day or two, I kind of give up. My time was too short. I needed more data to replicate their model, changing my infrastructure. And even if I replicated it, I didn't think Malware RL and SecML malware would be enough to get by it. The dropper that they gave looked really promising, but I couldn't get it to work on my Linux VM. And admittedly, I'm not big on, I'm very much at the depths of my knowledge here, and was getting kind of tired and frustrated and just giving up just a little bit, but not entirely. That did give me some ideas of, okay, maybe I can find something easier to use under traditional evasion. So let's focus on traditional evasion. I went on GitHub looking for all sorts of just open source cryptors, packers, droppers, setting just a threshold of if I can't get this to work right away, I'm just gonna give up. And unfortunately, most I either couldn't get to work, and those that I could get to work either produced output that wasn't a valid PE file, it didn't run, or it didn't evade secret or AMSquare, so it wasn't actually helping. And working or not, many of the files that were outputted actually bypassed Kipple, just because this was one of the huge shortcomings of Kipple was it had no knowledge of traditional evasion. That said, one package did stick out to me one program called Dark Armor. This is a Windows AV PE evasion tool. It's open source, it's Python based, so I can run it in my Linux VM. Really, really easy to use. Give it an input PE file, it's gonna spit out a new one with the original encrypted, and the new PE is gonna execute the old one in memory, piece of cake, and best of all is I can get it to run and it works. It's actually able to consistently evade all 6 of the classifiers. And not only that, what I can do is I take the output from Dark Armor, which is evasive to everybody, including Kipple. I then run it through Malware RL 1 or 2 times, not to really make it evasive, but to make it signaturable by Kipple, because Kipple is able to pick up anything going through Malware RL, and now the output from the tool is able to get by secret while being detected by Kipple. Again, this is a contest. I'm gaming the system just a little bit. Bad news though, the PE executes, but there's something wrong with the payload, and it doesn't actually execute the payload. So the file executes, but something's going wrong, and I try a billion options, and eventually look at the GitHub issues and find out everybody else was having the same problems as well. They couldn't get this to run. But I wasn't just ready to give up. I was trying one more thing. I'm gonna get this to work. I'm gonna use Donut and PEZor. I'm gonna use Donut, it's open source. I'm gonna convert my PE file to shellcode. I'm gonna throw that into PEZor and encrypt it a little bit. Again, open source, freely available. And I invest a lot of time making this work and everything, and it can evade all classifiers like Dark Armor, apply Malware RL, Kipple detects it, but doesn't work. And at this point, I get on to Slack, I reach out to the author, he's gonna help me a little bit, and time's up. I invested way too much into that attacker track. My initial thing was I'm just gonna throw a little bit into it, and you can see I got very carried away. So, okay, so I ran out of time. I did have a lot of fun doing that, but ultimately couldn't get any of those other attacks to work. So what ended up happening? What were the results? I know the title of my talk gave it away, but still gonna walk through it. Walking through, you can see Secret took first place. They had 162 bypasses. They were the lowest. AMSquare took second with 193, and Kipple a convincing third with 231. And the other 3 models all in between. On the attacker side, the results are pretty similar. More competitors, definitely, than the defender side, but Secret took first. They did a great job. 196 bypasses they got out of 300, but they only used 600 API queries, which was pretty low. AMSquare took second with 167 and a moderate amount of API queries, and me, you can see me, I'm RWCH. Yes, a modest 55,000 API queries. As I said, I got a little invested, all right? All right, so doing a little bit of critical analysis of what happened, a little bit of retrospective, because of course, I'm curious. Well, number one, Kipple had a really low false positive rate. There's more if you're interested in the paper and the other material on how I went about the false positive rate, but it was a little overly rigorous there. But number two, Kipple still missed a lot of the malware RL style attacks. If you just let malware RL run, it'll eventually get by Kipple, just acting randomly. And the reinforcement learning MAB malware, that other capability, it relatively handily was able to bypass Kipple without too much difficulty. But number three, which I think was probably the most important for why the scores were so high, is Kipple just lacked knowledge of the traditional non-ML evasion techniques. Cryptors, packers, a lot of the normal off-the-shelf stuff was enough to get by it without too much of a hurdle. On the attacker side, I think the attacker idea that I was following, using Atlas, walking through those steps, it had merit, but overall had mixed results. And this was for a few reasons. After the fact, AmSquare ended up publishing a little white paper on what they did for both tracks, and in their defensive model, they also used an ensemble approach, a variety of methods. They used gradient boosted decision trees, just like Kipple did, but also neural networks, and the fun one, some rules that they threw in there for anomaly detection. And from a data perspective, they used normal Ember and Sorel. So a lot of data. Sorel, I only used 32,000, and I think there's 20 million in that entire data set. So a lot of training data. But probably more importantly, they used a stateful defense, which compared the incoming samples to the previously classified ones. So me throwing a bajillion things at there didn't really help, because if one of those gets classified as malware, the others are going to look like it too. And that, along with those rules for anomaly detection, I think that's where I ended up getting hung up, being unable to evade AmSquare reasonably reliably. Secret, they also put a write-up out there. And I was surprised, maybe I misread it, but their model didn't seem too intense. It was a random forest with some custom feature extraction. Nothing too heavy there. But then from a training perspective, they only used the Ember data, which isn't much, along with 50 normal malware samples from the 2020 competition, which again, isn't a whole lot. But they acknowledge that they have a very high false positive rate. And they even put that little graph in there showing that when it came to the competition entry, what the organizers were doing was they were looking at just Windows false positive identification, kind of the built-in utilities, and their submission did great there, but they also looked at these other benignware sets where the false positive rate's up in the 80s. So it was a very sensitive model, and because the organizers were only looking at the blue box up here, they were able to meet that 1% classification rate. So a couple of just quick closing thoughts, lessons learned, takeaways, things like that. If you do end up wanting to get into this, building your own classifier, a couple of points I'd recommend. Make sure you have enough space and you dedicate enough time. It can be time consuming. You can do it quickly and on a space budget. But if you really want to get into it and dive in deep, make sure you've got both. And also just keep good records of everything you're doing so you don't end up reinventing the wheel or retrying stuff when you don't need to. When you're attacking a classifier, I think Atlas is a great way to orient yourself, but orient yourself and kind of build an attack to go back to the drawing board, kind of iterate that way. It's a good way for me to at least conceptualize what I was trying. And then reconnaissance can be fun, and you can go down a fun rabbit hole, even for adversarial AI. There's a reason it's included as that little column there. Also, another takeaway, I think adversarial ML is a lot of fun. There's tons of free stuff out there if you want to get into it and want to get started. I think it's a great thing to get into. And the last takeaway is contests can be gamed a little bit, and I am very guilty of that. And then a couple of quick notes on future work and discussion. All these materials, they will be released, if not already. This deck, the code behind Kipple, it's all out there on GitHub. I've also got on the GitHub repository a bunch of links that are to others working in this space, doing a better job explaining it. My infinite free time, which is obviously not infinite, but there's lots of other things I'd like to do. The biggest one was I really wanted to measure the applicability of adversarial ML on VirusTotal to see if things get by there. Anecdotally, it was hit or miss on some of those, but subject for future work, and just call to action. If MLSEC 2022 is happening, I'd highly recommend it. It was obviously a lot of fun. I hope that comes out. And it's good to think about how security and ML interact with each other. So with that, I'll thank you for attending. I think I've got a little bit of time for questions. You can reach me on Twitter, and then the code for Kipple is available down there. Yeah.
So you highlighted that secret was building custom features. Did you do any custom features?
Yep. So the question was, Secret used custom features. Did I use any custom features? And no. I used everything entirely just from Ember had a way to, kind of a built-in extractor for features, and I just used that, keeping it very simple.
Just curious, when does the competition get announced, and how long do you have to prepare for that before, you got to have something submitted?
I think they announced it in May with the Defender track, because I was looking at the calendar, was announced on June 16th. That's when the Defender track opened, and then it closed on July 23rd. So about 5 weeks is the amount for the Defender track.
Regarding the ML evasion, like the adding noise to binaries, what does that type of technique actually look like at like a code assembly level in the binary?
So like the TTPs used by like Malware RL?
Yeah.
It's been a while, like adding additional sections, some code overlays, flipping a few bits here and there.
Got
It's a lot of little small stuff, but the idea is like the little small stuff, you can chain it together, right, into something bigger. And if we use reinforcement learning as an AI attack technique, we can figure out the sequences that are good, if that helps.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, if there are no other questions, thank you.